Thank you. It's just so great to be here with you all. It is certainly no sacrifice for me to come to the Bay Area from the East Coast. I think of California, and especially the Bay Area, as maybe the most playful place I know on earth. You know, parts of Italy come second, but I don't know, play just sort of lives right here in the atmosphere. So I give Stuart no credit at all for being as playful as he is. If he lived on the East Coast and he was so playful, he'd get a lot of credit from me. But out here, it just sort of comes naturally. So I do live on the East Coast. I live in Maryland, outside Washington, D.C., which I can promise you is not a very playful place. The youngsters there, known as senators and representatives, have not learned to play together. They don't even do well in parallel play, let alone socio-dramatic play, forget it. It's maybe the least playful place on earth. But nonetheless, we keep trying, and we try with the Department of Education and everybody else to get the word out about play. And I am pleased to say that Sally Jewell, who's the new Secretary of Interior, which oversees the National Park Service and so on, she released a memo recently to her staff saying that all the children and youth programs were to have 4 goals, and one of them was play. Now, exactly what she meant, we're not sure, but we are working with people in the National Park Service to convey the message about what play can look like in the national parks. So we'll see how far we get. One thing about working on play is that you have to have kind of a long time span that you look at. In fact, someone said recently, if you're interested in social change of any kind, live a long time. Because really bringing about change can be a slow process. I mean, sometimes things happen quickly, and that's wonderful. But the deep, sustained changes, they take a long time. And somebody else said to me in the fall, I gave a talk at UVA in Virginia, and in the question time, a woman put up her hand and said, I interviewed you for my radio show 12 years ago, and you were saying the same things then. And I said, that is really depressing. And she said, no, what I really meant was you still have a passion for these things. And that is true. And I think she also meant, I haven't given up yet. I don't give up easily. One of my favorite toys when I was little was a pop-up doll. I don't know if any of you remember pop-up dolls. They were big and kind of funny shaped, and they had weight at the bottom. They were round on the bottom, and you'd knock them over, right? And they would endlessly pop up again. And the toys of our childhood we take into ourselves, and they kind of shape our global outlook on life. So one of my other favorite toys was Tinker Toys. I loved Tinker Toys when I was little. And then when I married a wonderful man from the South, and his family had bought a log house in the mountains of Tennessee in 1887. Southerners having very long time spans, which for me is a delight because I'm a first-generation American, so it's a nice balance. And there was a little 2-room log cabin behind the log house, and I fell in love with this log cabin, and so I spent several summers fixing it up with help from others. And I kept wondering, why am I devoting my vacations to this log cabin? And one day I remembered my Lincoln logs and all the hours I spent building log cabins as a child. So I think that's a big part of why I love my little 2-room log cabin in the mountains so much. Well, I want to talk about 2 main things today, and then at some point we're going to see a video that goes by this name. I want to talk about what is play, at least from my vantage point, having worked with young children so much, and how it becomes an integral part of their development. And then I want to talk about the fact that play has disappeared so much from childhood and what we can do to bring it back. So those are the main things I want to touch on today. Well, what is play? I have been to symposia where we spent hours talking about how to define play. It's not easy. We each have our own view on it. But I've been much influenced by the play workers in England and throughout the UK. Play workers are a quirky bunch who have been educated to know a great deal about play. And they spend all day working with children, usually children and youth of all ages, supporting their play but never directing their play. For them, the direction of children's play is strictly forbidden. They say we're present to support their play, but we wear a cloak of invisibility. So we take off the cloak from time to time when the children need us, but mostly we are a presence there to support. And what they say about play is this. They say that defining play is as hard as defining love. It's just so big and so fundamental to life that it's very hard to capture it in a neat little definition. But they say you can describe it, and this is how they describe it. They say play is a set of behaviors that are freely chosen, personally directed, and intrinsically motivated. So freely chosen, personally directed, intrinsically motivated. This goes along a lot with what we've already heard today from Stuart and from Jam. And in my language as an early childhood educator, what it says to me is that the ideas for play come bubbling up from within the child. I don't tell them what to play, though I've been known to suggest a theme or two, knowing that they will reject it, expecting them to reject my theme, but it often prompts a theme from them. I only do it in dire need. But play comes bubbling up from within them, and they get to choose what they want to play, and they get to direct what they want to play. And I would say probably 90 to 95% of the time in my mixed age preschool kindergarten classroom, I did not need to intervene in children's play. Once they were established, some of them took a few weeks or occasionally a few months, but once a child was established in independent play, they needed very little direct intervention from me. I'm going to give you some examples today, and in some of them I did intervene because children can get stuck or they can get out of balance and just need a little nudge back into balance again. Occasionally you have to do a bigger intervention, but mostly I found that children became very good players very quickly, if they weren't already when they entered the classroom. So one of the things that I feel strongly about with play is that it supports every facet of a child's development. Stuart went through a wonderful set of kind of categories of play. I'm going to approach it just a little differently and talk about how I would see children using play for their physical development, their social and emotional development, and their cognitive development, with some examples from the classroom. And physically, when I think about how the children used play, some of it was big motor, big muscle play, and some of it was very small motor play. Children engage in both. And I have to say, in a real play session, children use many types of play at once. They don't just fit into neat categories. But as an adult, it's a help to think sometimes of how this works. And what I saw with the large motor play is that children who were kind of well-balanced and well-coordinated in their play often were pretty well-balanced in life. And if they weren't well-balanced physically, they often had some other difficulties. And in fact, if I was teaching now and I had a child who was really accident-prone, I did have one such child, and I don't think I took it seriously enough. Because the youngsters I've known who were accident-prone, they were not in my class, by the time they were 18 and 20, they had all kinds of difficulties that had nothing to do with their physical body. But I think children, and you'll see when we see this video, children work on balance a lot, just out of themselves. It's like they know they need to be well balanced in their body, well coordinated. You know how you're walking along with a child, and if there's a little rise that they can walk on, right? They walk on it. They jump up on walls and walk on them. They challenge themselves all the time with balance at all ages. It's just an interesting phenomenon to watch. So I had a group of boys getting ready for first grade, so they were older boys, and it was a spring of the year, which can be a tricky time with the older children. They're kind of antsy to get on to first grade, and then they're kind of reluctant to get on to first grade, and they get caught. And this group, who had been good players all year, suddenly it was like they fell out of play. They didn't know how to play. And they were at it with each other and with everybody else. And they were, one week they just were creating chaos in the classroom. And we devoted the first hour or so of our 3-hour morning to play. And so when you get a group of children who are creating chaos for an hour, it's not fun. And then came maybe the Thursday. It was really raining hard. I knew the children didn't have enough rain gear with them. We were going to have to stay in for our second play period. I was dreading it. And over snack time, some of the children started talking about the circus being in town. And I kind of lit up. And I said, oh, we could play circus. And I'm thinking of something simple, right? And the children said, what could we do? And sometimes things would come out of my mouth as a teacher that I was appalled by, occasionally bad things, but sometimes just surprising things. And this was one of those occasions, and I heard myself saying, we could do the high wire act. Totally unthought out. And the children got very interested, of course. And they said, what can we do? And I'm thinking, right, what can we do? So I said, well, we'll clean up from snack and then let's see. So my mind is going, as quickly as it can, and we cleaned up everything, and I took our 2 big snack tables and put them end to end, but with a gap about this big between them. And then we had various planks that we used for play. So I took one that was long enough, put it there. It was maybe this wide, whatever that was, 9 inches or so wide. And I put a stump on the end of each. So the plank was on the tabletops, anchored with stumps, and, it's about so high off the ground. And these children, the boys, had gathered around. And then they said, we can't walk on that. And I thought, well, that's strange, because they're 6, they're ready for first grade. Usually by that point, children have quite good balance. Not as good as an adult, but quite good. And I said, well, I'll help you. So that was good, and they took turns crossing the plank and holding onto my hands as hard as they could, right? And after they had each done it a couple times, I could feel them loosening their grip a bit. And then they would say, one hand, right? No hands. All right. They walked forwards, they walked backwards. They hopped across, they walked with their eyes shut. They did everything they could on this plank. And after that, they began to play again. And I realized that on our playground, although we had things that children could, jump from stump to stump and do things for balance, by the time they were this age, they had outgrown those things on our playground. And if they lived in the country, there might be a log across a stream that they would be testing themselves on. But we didn't have logs across our nearby stream. We had bridges, and that's not very exciting. So there was no way these children could know that their balance had improved this much. And somehow it got stuck. Their whole play impulse got stuck. And then once they had mastered that next step, then they could play again. And I saw the same thing with a little girl who entered the kindergarten in the winter, and I thought she'd be fine from having met her, but she just couldn't connect with anybody until we had a big snowstorm and children could play in the snow, and that was fine. And then it melted on the playground, but there was a big mound across the edge of the parking lot where the snowplow had pushed it. And my older ones asked if they could play on it, and I said yes, as long as they didn't go down into the parking lot. So they, balanced their way across on this very uneven snowbank, and she wanted to play with them, but she wanted me to let her cross the playground to get to the end. And I certainly could have done that or held her hand, but I just said, no, if you want to play with them, you have to go across the snow. Well, the first day she slipped and slid and, didn't get very far. And the second day she got a bit further. And by about the third day, she could walk it. And after that, she could play. So there is something about the physical movement and balance and coordination that helps, I would say, kind of prime the pump for imaginative play for children and for social play for children. And when it's blocked, then you have difficulties. Now, that does not mean that a child with physical disabilities, can't play. But they may play more with language, they may play more in their mind, they find other ways to be playful. We have a cousin in our family who began life as a typically developing child and then became very, very ill when he was about a year old and lost all his external abilities. There's no part of his body he can control other than his eyes. So he can kind of do yes and no, or with his mom, they have a complicated system where he can look at different quadrants above his head, and she knows how to communicate really rapidly, guessing the letters that he's doing. He can't speak, but he's bright and alert, and he has the greatest smile in the world. And I was asked to do a chapter on play for a textbook on disabilities and recreation. And I thought, gosh, I'd love to know what Andy has to say about play. And he's in his early 30s, and I talked to his mom, and she said, well, why don't you ask him questions, and I'll write them down, and then he has an aide that can communicate well with him through his eyes, and they'll send you the answers. So I said, okay, good idea. So I asked Andy if this was okay with him, and he looked at me, which means yes. And I asked him a few questions, and his mom wrote them down. And as soon as I finished, his eyes start going all over the place, and his mom is popping letters all over the place. And I had not a clue what was going on. And when she got his message, she said, he wants to know, can it be X-rated? Well, I cracked up, and I looked at him, I said, it can be R-rated, but I don't want the X stuff. And he grinned, and his mom said, see, that's how Andy plays. He plays in his mind and he plays with language because he has no spoken language and he has no control of his limbs, but that doesn't mean he doesn't play, right? And I always sensed he was very playful because of the way he smiled and engaged without language, right? So play, as we've heard earlier today, it's so fundamental to life. It's part of all these different aspects. So there's the physical aspect. And I want to say a little bit about hands and their role in play. Because there's growing concern that children don't know how to use their hands anymore. Recently, the director of one of the children's museums stood up at a talk I gave, and she said, children come into our museum now, they don't know how to use scissors, they don't know how to do any of the things children used to know how to do. And I've heard the same problem from occupational therapists. And there was a big article in the New York Times a few years ago about a public school in New York, where the principal had frequently hired occupational therapists to work with children with disabilities to help them with their hand skills. And now he was hiring them to work with almost every child in the school because they didn't know how to use their hands. They couldn't hold pencils, pens, paintbrushes, just things that we think of as normal. And these children are normal in their development. They are typically developing children, but we are taking away from them so many of the basic human capacities that we've actually spent a long time on from an evolutionary perspective developing. There's quite a good book called The Hand by Frank Wilson, who's a retired now neurosurgeon who used to be in San Francisco. And he makes the point that an unusually large part of the brain is linked to the hand. And so when children learn with the hand, actually there's a lot of brain stimulation going on. And at that time, he was very critical of the amount of time children spent on keyboards or with a joystick or a mouse because he felt that was such minimal hand engagement. Well, frankly, nowadays that looks like a lot compared to, our whole intelligence is down to one finger. And we don't know yet what the long-term consequences of this will be for children. I don't believe it will be good. I think we're giving them some new things, that's great. We think that they're fabulous new things. I think they're good new things. I like my technology, I like my phone, my tablet, and all of that. But, you know, there's other things I think are more important in my life. Can't for the moment think what? No. No, only kidding. I do really like my tablet a lot, but but not as much as my husband. As I like my husband, and friends and family and being in nature and, you know, all of those things. We've given children something new, but we've taken away an enormous amount. And we have to reckon on that. We have to take responsibility for that. And we have a publication that we did with a couple of other organizations, and it's online, called Facing the Screen Dilemma, and kind of technology and early childhood. And we don't take a one-sided position. We do report on research, and then we talk about if you don't want to use technology, here's some good reasons to back you up. And if you do want to use technology in your classroom, here are the things to be mindful of. And you may know that the American Academy of Pediatrics and some of the other health groups say if you're using technology in your early childhood classrooms or centers, it shouldn't be more than for 30 minutes a week. Which is not very much. And frankly, 30 minutes a week, I wouldn't be overly concerned. It's the, you know, everyday large doses that take away from other experiences that children really need, including open-ended creative play. So what happens to children from a social emotional perspective in play? How does play support that? Well, we've all, I'm sure, have many examples that we could think of how children have used play socially. But I want to give one example, and it happens to be one where I did need to intervene a bit. Because I had two boys who were really good players, and they'd been friends for a couple of years. They played together, but they were very social, included lots of other children. They were not exclusive in their play. And then they went through a period in the kindergarten year where mentally they were really waking up. You know, they loved math. They would throw math problems across the table at snack time to one another, mental math. And, you know, it was fun to watch their minds awakening. But what was happening in their play was they would take our basket of ropes that we had, and they would tie all these knots above their heads. They took play stands, and just, it was like a big spider web that they would weave. And the thing is that children at that age learn to tie knots, and they love to tie knots. And I don't know at what age they learn to untie knots, but it is not in the kindergarten. So, you know, the occasional knot I didn't mind, but this was just this web of knots, and it would take me forever during cleanup time to untie knots. And I was philosophically opposed to cutting the ropes, but philosophical things fly out the window on one occasion, so I started carrying little scissors in my pocket and would kind of surreptitiously just cut these ropes so we could get on with cleanup. But after about a week of this, you know, that sense you get sometimes as a teacher that something's not right here. And also they were becoming very exclusive in their play. They wouldn't let anybody else into their house, into their spider web. And I decided it was good to give the ropes a rest. So over the weekend, I took the basket of ropes and I put them high up on a shelf. And I was expecting a big storm of protest on Monday, but when they came to me and asked for the ropes, I just said, the ropes need to rest today. And what I felt in them was relief, you know, as if they had gotten caught, hooked on something that they couldn't unhook themselves from. And so I watched them play for a few days, and their play began to open up again, and they began to play with other children. And so after a few days, when they asked for the ropes again, I trusted that they had moved on, and I gave them the basket of ropes. And then came a very interesting play, because now they and a group of children took these ropes and connected all the play houses that, you know, typically in the classroom, in the first 15 minutes of playtime, children would use all the props and create 5 or 6 different houses, trains, whatever, castles, spaceships. And they took these ropes and joined everything together like a big telephone network right? So instead of being like this in the ivory tower of their heads, they were now social, right? It was all spread out. Well, right in the middle of everything was a house built by a little girl named Victoria, who was extremely Victorian in her ways. She was a real proper little girl. And when any of these ropes touched her house, she would squeal as if electrocuted. She made it very clear that she did not want to have a telephone. Well, the children took this very seriously, so they put wood stumps at the corners of her house and would run the wires around the stump so it didn't touch her house. And one boy went and scribbled something, tied it on her house and said, "This says, no telephone here." And this play went on for days. And after a few days, Victoria decided that she would have a telephone after all. Oh, well, this was the big news in the kindergarten. Apparently, everybody talked about it at the dinner table because the next day, many parents said to me at the door, "Oh, does Victoria's family have a new phone number that we should put in the roster?" But just to say the ways that children can cut themselves off and the ways that children open themselves up to others, change themselves, change others. So often I'd watch children at play go through something like this, where a couple children were playing and they'd have their scenario worked out. They knew what they wanted to do, and along comes a third child who says, "Let's do such and such." And in my experience, almost always, the first two would say, "No, no, we're doing this." And then would be this pause, this magical pause. And they'd say, "Oh yeah, we could do that," and find a way to integrate the new into what they were already doing. Not abandoning what they planned, not permanently rejecting the new, but finding a way to integrate it. And I will tell you that in Waldorf schools, which is mostly where I did my teaching, Waldorf schools are faculty run. We don't have a principal or a head of the school, so we have to work everything out as faculty members, and we meet once a week to do that. It's not always fun. But from watching the children and how they socially negotiated, I learned so much about how to work with colleagues. There were always those colleagues that would say no to any new idea. And instead of taking it too seriously, I just let the new idea kind of filter in and wait for that pause and, oh yeah, maybe we could do it that way, right? And sometimes it took a week or two, but somehow we'd always get around to what I thought were good decisions. Not always what I would have done, but good decisions that we could reach collectively. Well, emotionally, children use play in quite serious ways to work through all sorts of things. If there's somebody ill, they'll often play out hospital play. I remember one day there were all these beeping noises going on in the classroom. I couldn't figure out what was happening, and it was annoying. These mechanical beeping noises, quite loud. So I went over to see what was going on, and I suggested that those were good outdoor noises and we needed to be a little quieter in the room. And they looked horrified. And they pulled this big plank out from under the table, and there was a child lying on it with bean bags all over him. And they said, "It's the life support system. We can't turn it off." And I fully agreed that we couldn't turn it off, but we could adjust the knobs a little bit. It's a hospital. It needs to be a little quieter in the hospital, right? You can always find some little way to get your way without completely disrupting theirs. But one of the most poignant play scenarios that I saw was one Monday, one of the moms pulled me aside and said that a close friend of the family had died suddenly over the weekend. And the family was upset about it, and Kirka, who was in my class, age maybe 5.5, was quite upset about this man's death. And I was so glad the mother told me, because then I fully understood why Kirka went to her friends and said, "Let's pretend that I've died and you've come to help me," right? And the beautiful thing about preschool, kindergarten friends is nobody goes, "Oh, yuck, how morbid." Oh no, they lit up. It was like, wow, we've never played that before. So they went and got the same plank, it's a bit wide, and Kirka laid down on the plank, and her friends picked her up and carried her around this room in stately procession, right? And then set her down very carefully, and then they went and got vases of flowers and candlesticks and pretty stones and just created a beautiful space for her, and periodically would pick her up again, because there's actually not so much you can do for someone who's dead, but they did everything they could think of, you know, for one play session, and the next day again, and the third day again, and I'm watching more carefully than I normally would, just to make sure it wasn't getting too morbid or that they were getting stuck in this, but they seemed to be carrying it fine. And then on this third day, her friend Kristen came to me and said, Kirka is dead. And I said, again, I have no idea why, kind of shades of ancient Egypt where you took offerings of food to the dead. I said, well, I'll bring something. And looking around, and it was shortly before Easter, and I had a basket of hand-painted wooden Easter eggs. And so I pick up the basket, not knowing what I was going to do. And I went over to Kirka, and I knelt down beside her. And for 3 days, she's been like this, right? But with her eyes a little bit open so she could see a little bit. And I just knelt down next to her, and she suddenly sits up and goes, I'm alive again. I'm alive again. And got up and proceeded to play in other ways. But I had such a sense that she and her friends had really worked through something. And as a little follow-up to that, a few years ago, I got a notice that her mother had died. And I went to the funeral, and I hadn't seen Kirka since she was in 7th or 8th grade. Now she was in her early 30s and married with her own little child. And so after she had greeted everybody, I had a chance to talk with her, and I said, Kirka, I wonder if you remember the time that you played dead in the kindergarten. And she said no, she didn't remember. I didn't really expect her to, because these deeper play things children don't usually remember. And I said, well, I'd like to tell you about it. And she said, yes, I'd like to hear. So I described it all, more or less as I described it to you, and she just hung on to every word. And at the end she said, I worked it through. And I said, yes. And the words didn't need to be spoken, but they were right there, and now I'll work it through again. Right? And that's the other part about play, is that it helps children work things through in the moment, but it lays a foundation for all the things that come in life. I've seen it in my own life. I'm in touch with a number of my former children who are now in their late 30s or early 40s. And you see how these things come back around, and it gives them a chance to work through now on an adult level issues that were important to them when they were young, that they played with. So I feel like the work we do as early educators, this is in the seed stage. We don't know what will happen to all those seeds, but they don't get lost, right? They kind of go underground, and then they emerge again. So just one last example I want to give you of sort of how children use play in a cognitive way. And so there was a very bright, a little bit nervous fellow, very bright. Actually, his nervousness settled down after a few months. He was very high-strung in the beginning of coming into our class. Keenan was his name, and a nice guy, really quite delightful. So it was his 3rd year with me, and he was a really good player by now. And one day he played by himself, which was unusual because he usually played with his friend Stephen and a bunch of other children. But on this occasion, he was determined to make a car that he could steer. Now, making a car was not unusual in my classroom because I had the strange philosophy that the preschool kindergarten was the place to reinvent the wheel every day. And so we didn't have any cars. But the children loved playing with cars, so they had to invent their own, and that was very good for them, in my view. And one of their favorite ways to do it was to take stumps and put it on their side and put a plank on it, and then 3 or 4 children could straddle this and move it along, and periodically the plank would separate from the stumps, and they'd all get off and adjust it and get back on and go a little further. And that was fine if you wanted to go straight, go forward or backwards as long as it was straight. But now Keenan wanted it to be able to go around corners. So he took the basket of ropes and he tried tying things together every which way. And this was one of the few times that I interjected myself into play, not because the child really needed it, but because I was so interested. I wanted to see if I could do something. But I quickly concluded that what he needed was an axle and a steering rod, and we didn't have those. So I kind of backed out, and he worked at this for about 45 minutes, and then just realized couldn't do it. And Ashley Montagu, was a well-known anthropologist, used to say that children's play is like the scientists' work in the laboratory. You try, what if I try it this way? Well, what if I try it this way? And the good scientist is not disappointed when his experiment fails, because he learns as much from failure as from success. And it's the same with children's play. So here Keenan, in one sense, had failed at his task, but he didn't seem concerned about it. And he went on and played with his friend Stephen, and that was all fine. Now, a little while later, maybe a couple weeks, Keenan is standing at my elbow while I'm paddling some butter that we've churned, getting the liquid, the whey off of it. And he's thoughtful. And he says to me, when you put the cream in the butter churn, it was white. And now the butter is yellow. Why? And I said, I've often noticed that, but I don't know why. And that was okay for me, but not okay for him. So he just stands there thinking. You could, practically feel the thought processes going around in his mind. And I'm thinking of him trying his ropes and his, steering thing one way and another. And I could feel him trying this idea out. And he says, I know why. He said, you see, the cream came from the cow, and the cow ate grass. And the grass is green, and green is made of blue and yellow. And that's where the yellow comes from. So, needless to say, I was pretty impressed by the thought process. But here's the really interesting thing, that when I shared this with some parents, one of the mothers said, I have cows, I've made a lot of butter, he's absolutely right. And I said, what? And she said, you see, in the summer when the cows eat grass in the meadow, the keratin in the grass turns the butter yellow. And in the winter, when they're in the barn eating hay, they have white butter. And if you remember Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, her mother often would grate some carrot to get some yellow coloring to put into the winter butter, because people like that sunny meadow butter, right? And so, I feel like children play at things physically, and then as their minds really awaken, they play at the same things mentally. It's a kind of interplay. It's like our cousin Andy, playing with language, Keenan playing with ideas now, trying things one way, trying things another. And all of that is made possible by play. And therefore, the fact that we take play away from children seems so incredibly tragic to me, when they need it so badly, especially now, because it just feels like we pile stress into children's lives more than we ever did before. I mean, it used to be, of course, if you grew up in abject poverty or with abuse or in a war zone, you had a lot of stress in your life. But if you were fortunate enough to have, decent family life and decent home and so on, people didn't worry about stress in childhood. But children are stressed today. We have such high expectations of them in every area of life. And what we know about play is that it's a wonderful stress reducer. So on the one hand, we pile more stress on our children with all of our expectations, and we take away what I think of as the number one way they have of reducing stress, which is through play. But the good news is that one can bring play back. We can bring it back into our classrooms, we can bring it back into neighborhoods, into playgrounds, parks, wherever. It's not easy. Sometimes it's really hard, but it's not impossible. And I want to show you this film because it shows one way that play was brought back into a public school, in this case in England, And I wish we could do the same thing across this country. They've done it now in a lot of schools in England. And what they did was they brought in what are called loose parts, just open-ended play objects. Now, they can be natural materials. In this case, they're from a scrap store. And by the way, I was in a fabulous scrap store down in San Jose a couple of years ago. It's still there. Probably a lot of you know it. You know, that kind of place where for a few dollars you just get a ton of stuff, right? Stuff is what we're talking about here. And children do all sorts of things with it. And it opens up the play possibilities, because on most playgrounds, what you get is physical play and maybe a little bit of imaginative play. But with loose parts, you get a lot of imaginative play integrated with the physical. I myself love having natural items as loose parts out on a playground, stumps and logs that are down and boulders and stones and, you know, sand and water and all of those things are also loose parts in a way. They're play materials. But I've also come to appreciate over the years the role of these sort of throwaway items. So let me just show you part of this film. And there's a few things that you might just watch for because it goes by quickly. The beginning is in high speed. It slows down after a moment. But watch how the children practice balance, right? Just as part of their play. And also, you know, make-believe play and, oh, there was something else that stood out for me. Let me just check my notes here. Ooh. Oh, yes, they create a very complicated game for themselves with sort of PVC pipe that's cut in half and becomes like a channel. And you can just feel that they've negotiated all these rules and all these ways of playing this, although you don't see that part. But it's fun to see what they've created. So let's see if I can get this going.
What you are about to see is the result of a pilot study. The next 60 seconds shows a whole school lunchtime speeded up, followed by a more detailed look at the scrap store play pod.
Here it goes.
The aim of this study was to find out if introducing loose parts into primary schools during lunchtime could benefit children's free play and support their behaviour in school. The study was an immense success and provided a wealth of evidence that children who are happy and engaged in play have a better experience at school. It has also been found that the adults in the school have a better experience of their school day. We have found that introducing a scrap store play pod in schools during lunchtime has 1. Introduced learning through play, 2. Significantly enhanced inclusion for all children, 3. Increased critical skills development, and 4. Helped to improve children's relationships and self-confidence. The Scrap Store Playpod helps to meet the 5 outcomes of Every Child Matters, and it enables children to experience other learning opportunities such as teamwork, negotiation, risk management, conflict resolution, improved communication, and problem solving, all of which add up to happier, engaged children in school at lunchtimes.
This is our dad. We love using the play. Come in the den. It's really good.
It's had a real impact on the quality of the children's play.
It's given children a whole diverse range of things to do. It's given an opportunity to develop creative play. And more than anything, it's given them the chance to have a lot of fun and to work together as small groups, pairs, big groups. It's encouraged them to do a lot more talking.
The materials in the play pod don't dictate the way that children play with them. Children are free to use their imagination.
has helped to integrate individual children who were finding playtime and lunchtime a difficult time for them. And anecdotally had several parents who come up to me and said, my child is much, much happier at school now because they dreaded lunchtimes and now they're really enjoying them.
Cutting dress! 3, 6, 5, 7.
Behaviour post-lunchtime, apparently, so the teachers tell me, has been significantly improved. Children come in a little bit more tired, which is good. They've had some good physical exercise, but they're also ready to learn. And teachers feel there's less of that kind of post-lunchtime frustration.
The children have never been as occupied as they have since we had the play pod. They go into afternoon school happier than they were previously because they've had less disputes.
Should we do something else? That'll work. That'll move. It can go up now. One more off here. Yeah, now let's get there. No, put it over. Still got millions of cornrows here. Put it down. Right, guys. Don't put it high, otherwise it won't go up. That should definitely go in. You need to move that one back. It won't go off yet.
I had a really good response from our supervisors. They've had some good quality training, seen a bit of a sea change in their attitude to lunchtimes. They now see lunchtimes as an opportunity for children to enjoy themselves rather than as a testing time for them to organise eating and discipline and so on. I think the emphasis has shifted firmly in the direction of play and fun. Also, there's been a big change in their perceptions of risk and how we manage risk.
I thought it might be difficult to get this scheme off the ground with the lunchtime supervisors, but actually they're all for it. They love it because they can see that the children are so occupied. And also it's resulted in less disputes between the children, less bad behaviour, so the dinner ladies have actually had an easier time.
Everybody who's involved in the play pod has been empowered by the process. The staff, the children.
Mixed age, mixed gender, groups of children playing, working together, problem solving.
I was impressed by the children who don't normally play together were playing together.
There's that kind of burst of creativity that we see across the age range, both genders, and that's been really encouraging.
Jump onto my foot! It's gonna be so cool! I love everyone! I love the play pod!
So there's a couple more minutes of that, but you can find it easily by Googling Scrap Store Play Pods England, or just Play Pods England. There's 2 YouTube videos, this one and one about early childhood, about young children playing with the same materials. But in this one, it was so dramatic and so clear that I thought I'd show you that. But the other one is also delightful. They each run about 10 minutes. So a few years ago, I worked with a local group, the Nature Collaborative, that's based in this area. And we did a project in San Jose at a big child care center to bring nature objects, loose parts from nature, into the play. There was big equipment there, and there were some picnic tables. And then they had carts that they would bring out each day during playtime with different play materials. And so a couple of the carts got converted over to having natural materials, and we put some tree slices and some stumps and some other things. We wanted to do a bigger transformation of the play area, but they were going to be moving the next year. So there wasn't much point in bringing in really big things. But even so, at the end of the year, with the evaluation that we did with the teachers who were out on the playground with the children, I was astonished at what changes they had seen. Just a much higher degree of play, easier, better behavior, not a lot of behavioral difficulties, and also that the children with disabilities, it was much easier for them to integrate in the play with the other children. And that was also hinted at a bit here in terms of some children with special needs who had had difficulty playing before but could find their way in. And one of the first play projects we ever did in the Alliance was in Franklin Park, Illinois, which is a little working class community near O'Hare Airport, where we brought a play worker over from England. Her name's Penny Wilson. Brought her over probably about 10 times now to this country. But she helped the staff figure out ways to bring play into all of their programs. And the summer camp people told us afterwards that, so instead of having every minute organized for the children, they gave them chunks of time for free play. And there were, that summer, quite a few children with some special needs in the program that they just integrated so easily, whereas in the past they probably wouldn't have made it in the camp. But with this kind of play, children just find their own level, their own way. There's a whole scope, a whole range of what they can do. I think you could see that. I don't feel like I have to even say very much, but children of all abilities can find their way with it. And it equalizes, the play situation. I remember early on in my teaching life, we had a little girl who was quite handicapped and had no mastery of any of her limbs. And I remember one day, she often would stay in during recess, and sometimes the child would stay in with her. And so this one day, this one little girl was like dressing her up, and putting her in front of the mirror so she could see herself. And in free play, the differences don't matter so much. What matters is the commonality. And if you've watched children with different languages playing, it absolutely doesn't matter. They don't know one word of one another's language, and they happily play together. There's something about play that's so primal, so basic to human life, and as we know, to animal life, but I know more about human life than I do about animal play. And I'm just so impressed with it. And then I just wonder why? Why do we let it fade out of children's lives? Why do we actually resist bringing it back in? And I've pondered these questions a long time. I don't have easy answers. One answer that's quite clear to me is that people have a lot of fears about the risk element of play. I mean, you look at some of this, right? A nervous parent or teacher could have a lot of fears, balancing on a chair like that, right? And various things. But the interesting thing is that when risk is obvious to children, they rise to it. They know how to handle risk. It's built into us as human beings, actually. And often we don't get to practice it as children, but if children do practice it, they are quite good at risk assessment. And so the little book that unfortunately wasn't here but is available, Adventure, The Value of Risk in Children's Play, that came about because whenever we talk about play with parks departments, what I call the big three issues would come up immediately, right? No, too many injuries if we have risky play. The insurance companies will want a lot more insurance from us, and we'll have a lot of lawsuits. So we decided to test it. And we commissioned somebody to interview directors of adventure playgrounds and other play experts, and here's what we learned from especially the adventure playgrounds here in California that are over 30 years old, that they have very low accident rates, that the insurance companies don't charge them anything more for having an adventure playground than they do for anything else they offer. And of the three, and mind you, this is over a 30-year period, two of them had one lawsuit each and the other one never had a lawsuit, right? And these are, if you've been to the Berkeley one, perhaps the other two are in LA, right? You know, that's a hammer and nails playground. And the biggest risk they feel is the nails on the ground. So they're absolutely strict that children have to have closed shoes on. No flip-flops, no bare feet. But otherwise, there's very few rules. And the children can check out the hammers and the nails and the saws. And there's play workers present to kind of be supportive without interfering too much. And they build these rickety-looking houses. And one day when I was there, I thought, I can't believe these houses stand very well. I'm just going to shake it. Well, you know what? When children build, they use so many nails. That house would stand longer than my house will stand. Earthquakes and whatever. And so what happens at adventure playgrounds like that is when they need more room for more new houses to be built, they just cut them off with a chainsaw. Then they have a nice bonfire. I was at one in Switzerland that was going through that process. And wonderful bonfire. And this 10-year-old boy was helping the man who was there, you know, tend the fire. Very carefully, mindfully, but with a lot of fun. So what are we going to do about getting play back into early childhood education? Back into kindergartens, not just preschools. I will not rest till we get it back in kindergartens again. Thank you. Here's what we're working on at the moment in the Alliance for Childhood. We think that one of the primary reasons that play has disappeared from kindergartens and increasingly from preschools is because in this country, and this is not true of all countries, but in this country, we are convinced that if we can teach children to read in kindergarten, they will succeed much better. And we are especially convinced for low-income children, but we're convinced all children should read, and it's now engraved in the Common Core standards that children need to read emergent literature with purpose and understanding by the end of kindergarten. Okay? Why? Why? There is no evidence of any long-term gains for children who are taught to read in kindergarten compared to children who are taught to read in first grade. I won't go into all the studies, but we're about to publish a paper on this. It should be released in September. And we hope to do a whole campaign around this to kind of wake up America. And it's not easy to wake up America once it has its mind set on something. But to say, look, we talk about evidence-based education. This is faith-based education. This is not, I mean, we have 20, 30 years of studies trying to find some long-term gains without finding any. If you look at the NAEP scores, you know, what's called the Nation's Report Card, the test that's given to about 150,000 students across the country in 4th grade and 8th grade, there's charts on the website for 23 years of scores in literacy and math. Now, the math scores have gone up. The literacy scores over a 23-year period have yet to increase by 1%, which would make you think that what we're doing isn't working. But what it makes the policymakers think is we're not starting early enough, right? So we're determined to do everything we can. We're working with a group in Boston. Hope actually to do a release at Harvard, if possible, in September, to kind of make the point with the media, with the blogosphere, with all those people out there listening, and ultimately with the Department of Education, that the path we're on is not working, and that what works is play-based experiential learning. So do watch for that paper, and in fact, if you haven't signed up on our website, which is allianceforchildhood, oneword.org, do so. It's free of cost, and we don't besiege you with emails, but once a month we send out an update, and then occasionally, you know, something that's really timely we'll send out. And that way you know about whatever we're doing. And we're doing something else because, we ask ourselves, okay, what if we're successful? And we get people to say, all right, we get it. We made a mistake. The kindergarten standards shouldn't be in Common Core. They should come out so that we can build it up anew from a developmental perspective. There were no early childhood people on the committee that wrote those standards. It was all like from 12th grade and you keep going down. So, okay, we made a mistake, but now what should we do, right? How do we actually bring play-based experiential learning into classrooms? And it's a challenge. Many of you are doing it, and you know that it's a challenge. It's not the easiest form of education to do. Scripted teaching must be incredibly easy compared to play-based experiential learning, except that you're making all your children miserable. But other than that, it's easy. So we have a grant to work on a digital resource, what we called a toolkit, but we were told to call it something else, and I haven't found the right word yet. But it's going to have video footage and photographs and written parts and links to reports and, different layers and blogs that talk about different aspects of play-based experiential learning, by which we mean content that's brought by teachers, but in experiential ways. So books, yes, but also storytelling and verses and songs, a lot of oral language as well as books. A lot of hands-on activities. We just did some filming on the East Coast and have a delightful series of just things that I saw in 2 mornings in preschools of the bread baking and the drawing and the painting and the block building and I can't even remember all of the different little parts to this, because in a good play-based program, children are using their hands all the time for learning, right? And we'll have other videos coming out of that as well. So that won't be ready till next spring, but watch for that as well. We think and hope that it will be really helpful to teachers in making the case, if you already are convinced about play, and I'm sure most of you are, but also for ones who may not be so sure, to get a stronger idea of what it's all about. So it's a combination of content that teachers bring experientially and time for child-initiated play, because these two things really support one another. And I think it was best said by a 7-year-old who said, "At recess, I remember everything I learned." Right? Doesn't that say it all? And when you see children at play, they integrate everything, right? Everything they've heard from their teachers in the classrooms, what they've seen on the screen, what they're experiencing at home, it all gets mushed together in a way. It all gets combined and digested by them, and they make it their own. And it's not a case of in one ear and out the other, by no means. It's coming in through all their senses and working its way all the way down to their toes, and they really make it their own. And that's the kind of learning we want for children. It's effective, it's fun, and it primes the pump for a lifetime of love of learning. And to take that away from children is, in my view, really a crime. And so, a friend of mine, when her children went to first grade, she has twins, the teacher said to her, "I love teaching first grade because the children are still enthusiastic about learning. And I look across the hall at the 4th grade class and the light is out." And I tell you, that is not satisfactory. Children should not have their light turned out. They should be enthusiastic learners their whole lifetime. And with that, enthusiastic players, because the two are so woven together. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And maybe we have time for a few questions. Thank you. Thank you. So it can be comments. It doesn't have to be a question. It could be an argument. I don't mind arguments. I'm from the East Coast. We like arguments.
I think one of the best words that you use, just one of the many, and I thank you for being here, it's so enlightening for everyone, is the word invisible for the teacher. So often we see in the classroom especially in the early childhood classroom that we are a part of, is the table that's set up in kind of an oval where the teacher sits in the middle and then the children sit around. What is your feeling about that?
Well, I did a variation on that, which was that every day during the children's hour or so for play, I did some kind of real work. Now, it might be painting one day, baking another day, sewing, different seasonal activities. Sometimes I sat at a round table, sometimes I sat at the end of a table, and children just came and went on their own. I didn't organize it. And in the beginning, I was nervous about that as a teacher. I thought, what if they don't come? You know, what if I just work by myself all day while they play? But it's not like that. Children see us doing real activity and they're fascinated by it. And so the most common questions in my classroom were, what are you doing? Can I do it too? You know, and they would do it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, it depended on the child and their age and their interest. And then they'd go back to playing again. But I did learn one thing along the way, that most activities I did, the girls would come to first and the boys would go in and play. And I didn't like that. So I also had to think of lots of activities where the boys really were drawn to it. Now the boys liked all of the activities. They liked sewing, they liked all of it, but they often didn't come to it because they would have gone and built their houses and they're very territorial and they didn't want to leave it. And when I finally realized that, I would just say, well, let's leave a guard here to watch over it. You all come and help me now. And then they were happy to come. So I found, and in fact, not just I, but in Waldorf education, we do a lot with this, that this relationship between purposeful adult work and children's play really deepens the mood of the play. And when I would visit classrooms, and I've done a lot of that around the world, you could pretty much tell which classrooms the teachers were focused and concentrated on something, and where the teachers were sort of flitting from thing to thing, and then the children tended to flit in their play. But where the teacher was concentrated, but with ears wide open to everything in the classroom, usually the play went deep. And then you'd get what we call the hum of play, where you just feel, it's not that anybody's actually humming, but you know, a lot of nods of head. There's a sense of hum, of peacefulness in the room. Stuart, I think, used the word bliss this morning. I really liked that, because I'll tell you that sometimes when that hum of play was going on, this thought would arise in me, this is as close to heaven as you are likely to get in this life, right? So I think there's a place for teachers to be sitting and working, but with ears open and just as a kind of help for children to concentrate and focus on their play.
Yes, I've also noticed, I lived in Israel for many years, and many of the kindergartens and preschools have the scrap yard.
Oh, yeah.
And a friend of mine once came to see, and she said, well, we don't have these in the States. That's just dangerous. And my question is, how do we as teachers communicate to parents the importance of this? What kind of language can we be using to share the benefits of this free play for the children, this exploratory play? How can we get the parents more involved in that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'm thinking back to meetings I was in New York City where this question came up, and people who were doing play in parks and other places said, you know, when you do it and the parents see it happening, they get it. And that's been largely my experience too. And in Franklin Park, this little community near O'Hare Airport, if you could have heard those park staff the first day we were there, all the reasons they couldn't bring play in because parents wanted skills in this area and everything organized and scheduled. And I mean, you would have thought this was the harshest public school in the world that you were hearing about. And it was Parks and Rec, for heaven's sakes. But when we went back a year later, boy, were they singing a different tune, because they had actually done it and the parents loved it. And in fact, they had tried for several years to have enough enrollment to do a winter camp and a spring camp over breaks, and they never had enough enrollment until that year. Because what they said was the children were so happy that the parents saw that, and that really spoke to them. So in some ways, I think we just have to do it, like they just did it with that play pod, just to do it and let the children respond and let the parents see. Parents do want their children to be happy. Yes. Yes. Right. I know that the teachers are afraid of it. And to a large extent, they're afraid of the parents' reaction, right? But also in themselves, they're afraid, if the children get dirty or it's too messy to clean up. I had to get over a whole thing about messy cleanup. You just have to overcome it. And then you realize the children love to clean up. Just give them brooms and they'll do it, with you. Not necessarily for you, but they love doing it with you. But teachers have all sorts of objections. So that's a place to really talk things through, and maybe show, look at this video together and talk about what it would be like, or the early childhood version. What would it be like in the shed to have things that just come out, or a little trolley that just comes out with things, How bad could it be? Having a few extra Band-Aids around would be my answer. Because you will get some scrapes, but you don't get more than that generally. And there is a saying in England, maybe this goes too far for you, better a broken bone than a broken spirit. Please.
Thank you very much for your discussion. One of the things that I'm curious about is in the midst of the video is, and I think another really important part of play is conflict resolution. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my experience with conflict resolution is that when children become good players, they're also good at resolving conflict. Why? Because they want the game to keep going, right? They don't want somebody going off in a huff and then the play falls apart. So the trick is to get them to become good players, in my experience, rather than focusing too much on conflict resolution. Because once they're good players, they resolve conflicts on their own. And if you need to intervene, you can, but usually they will. And when I intervened, you never know who started the conflict, right? It's hopeless. Now, who started this? Who hit who first? I mean, preschoolers? Forget it. You just put an arm around each one, and you say, well, soon you'll be friends again. Off they go. That's my solution. Please.
Hi. Is this on? Yes, okay. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm very glad to be here and glad to be hearing you. The message is very important, obviously, and I feel like the message is much more important. You're preaching to the choir, it seems like. And I'm a filmmaker, and I'm making a movie about early childhood education and the importance of play-based early childhood education. And I'd love to plug my film, but that's not why. And it's called Underneath Blue Skies, and it's on Kickstarter right now.
Okay.
I think the most important thing is that we understand, and at least I do, because I'm a dad. I've got a 4-year-old daughter. Is that the message needs to get to the parents that it is about play, that the play-based learning is the most important thing. I'm not putting it all on you because I'm already taking responsibility for it myself, but how do you think we can, everybody assembled here, get that message to the parents most effectively?
Okay. Well, I think films are a big help, and video presence on the internet. Parents look at the internet, they want short things. But I will tell you about preaching to the choir. I never mind preaching to the choir, because if the choir can't sing well, we will never get the message out, right? And also we need each other for support. It's kind of lonely out there, right? So we need each other. So I'm grateful for events like this. How do you reach parents? I think the biggest way is you as an educator talking to the parents in your class. They trust you. They would not have their children with you if they didn't trust you. You don't have to be Mr. or Miss Know-It-All on this. You can just sincerely share what you're experiencing, what you were thinking about play. Some people do it in conversation, some people do it through photos, some people do it through recording things. whatever works for you, to share with parents some of the delightful things that you are seeing in children's play and how powerful that is. Yeah, that was for me always, something to do, and to invite parents and that they can see it for themselves. I liked having parents visit. I liked scheduling it. It wasn't exactly a wide open door, but it was an open door. But parents get it in my experience. I mean, I know they resisted at first, but ultimately parents love their children and want what's good for their children. So when they see that this is good for them and the children are thriving with it, they do come around. That's so far been my experience. Please.
I have a comment. I just wanted to say that I think we could learn a lot from the Waldorf schools in that the children, all the way through 12th grade, spend a lot of time playing and a very small amount of time actually doing the academic work. I mean, they have academic work, but they're not given homework till 4th grade. Very little stress placed on that. And yet in Sonoma County, where I live, our Waldorf school, 12th grade, almost every year have the highest SAT scores in our county. So they're not really stressed, they're playing a lot, and they love school for the most part. So
Thank you. I try not to plug Waldorf, but I don't mind if somebody else does. Because in the Alliance, we try to be equal treatment to all good forms of education. Thank you, though.